HAZLOC, seal placement in zone 1 and 2 locations. In this presentation, we're going to look at two diagrams, one from zone 1, one from zone 2, and we're going to look at the requirement for conduit and cable, explosion seals, flammable fluid migration seals, and finally, when we can get away with a standard tech cable connector with no seal on the fitting at all. We're going to differentiate between these three different types by the color. Red is explosion, green is flammable fluid migration, and a standard gray covering is simply no seal at all when used in reference with a tech connector. The types of wiring methods we're going to utilize are threaded rigid metal conduit and tech cable. Well, let's get started on zone 1. Now, where we're going to be drawing our information from is 18104, which is sealing within a zone 1 location. You'll notice that we have an explosion-proof panel board with circuit breakers in it, an explosion-proof junction box down below it, an EXE, increased safety E junction box, and an explosion-proof 3-phase motor. If we start at the very beginning of 18104, subrule 1, it indicates that explosion seals are required on conduit when we enter into an explosion-proof enclosure, which creates arcs and sparks or high temperatures. Now this, being a panel board with circuit breakers, is assumed to generate arcs and sparks. If we contrast that against the EXD junction box down below, it would be assumed that this device does not generate arcs and sparks because we're simply doing Moret connections. So with that in mind, we're going to focus our efforts on the conduits coming out of the explosion-proof panel board up above. And when we read through the rule, it indicates that when we enter into this enclosure, we need to ensure that we have an explosion-rated seal within 450 millimeters of the enclosure, and that would be for all three of those seals. Now, what about the conduits that are leaving the location? If the conduit leaves the location, we also need to consider the requirement for additional seals. Now, 18104 subrule 3 indicates that we may need seals when we leave the boundary into the non-hazardous area. However, it states that there can be nothing in between the seal and the boundary when it comes to equipment that is installed, tees, or fittings. And the highlighted area here indicates that there is no such item in that area, which means a second seal would not be required on this conduit. If we look at the second conduit down, there happens to be a coupling in the middle between the seal and the boundary. However, that is accounted for within the rule, and they consider that to be acceptable. So due to this, we do not need a second seal in this conduit section. Let's take a look at the conduit down below coming out of the explosion-proof junction box, and it passes out into the non-hazardous area. We know from 18104 subrule 3 that we do have a maximum distance we could go external to the zone 1 location of 1 meter, and we have the choice of placing the seal inside the hazardous area or outside. For this one, I'm going to choose to place it outside. If we look at the conduit down below, yet again, this is an EXE, increased safety junction box, and this again has a conduit that leads to the non-hazardous areas. We have the exact same requirement, which says maximum 1 meter. In this particular scenario, I am simply going to choose to place the EX seal on the zone 1 side. Now, if we take a look at the conduits on either side, on the other side of my junction boxes, we've already talked about the conduit that leaves the explosion-proof junction box. We said it does not create arcs and sparks, and due to that, does not require a seal. But what about the EXE, the increased safety junction box? Well, the conduit leaving that junction box is coming out of a plastic junction box, and the code at no point states that we need to have any sort of seal for that application. And so because of the lack of direction given, we do not need any seals in the two conduits leaving those two junction boxes. Well, let's take a look then at the cables. The cables are going to enter into, in a few different places, explosion-proof rated enclosures and non-explosion-proof. So 18104, when we're dealing with cables, we have two different rules which may be relevant, subrule 7 and subrule 8. Subrule 8 is indicating explosion seals are required on a cable every time they enter into an explosion-proof rated box. So these two would need to be explosion-rated seals. On these two, same idea. These are explosion-rated seals because it's an explosion-proof junction box. The two down here are coming out of a increased safety E junction box, which is not an explosion-proof box. If we take a look at the rule 18104, subrule 7 indicates that we can use a FFM or flammable fluid migration seal for the cable that is entering in from the non-hazardous location. On the other side, where we have the cable passing into or terminating into the junction box and then continuing on within the zone 1 location, no seal is required. Now, finally, what about the EXD or explosion-proof three-phase motor? Well, it's an explosion-proof rated piece of equipment, and due to that, an explosion-rated seal is then required on the tech connector. Now, what about a Zone 2 application? Zone 2 is far more forgiving and there are less stringent requirements. We're going to be looking at 18154 in order to determine where seals are necessary in this diagram. We're first going to start at the very beginning of 18154, subrule 1, which indicates explosion seals in conduit systems are necessary every time we enter into an explosion-proof enclosure. Now, the EXD panel board is indeed explosion-proof, and it is the only explosion-proof enclosure in the diagram. That means that these three conduits which enter into the panel board are required to have explosion-rated seals within the 450 millimeter distance if these were factory-made threaded entries. Now, what about the conduits which leave the location? The conduits that leave the location would be covered under 18154, subrule 2. And where they leave this location, they note that there must not be any couplings or fittings or tees or anything like that. But most specifically of interest is no couplings. For the first conduit, it looks totally fine. There is nothing in between the seal and the boundary, and that means we do not need a second seal in the conduit. If we look at this one down below, this one has a coupling right smack in the middle, and that is not permitted as per the rule. So what we need to place in here is a flammable fluid migration seal as indicated in 18154, subrule 2. Now, this seal could be either inside or outside of the zone 2 location, but you could not have anything between the seal and the boundary installed. If we take a look at the rest of the conduits, this one too is leaving the location and therefore a flammable fluid seal is required. It would have to ensure that no coupling or equipment was installed between the seal and the boundary. And same with this one down here, we would need to have a flammable fluid seal. I'm going to choose to place it on the outside of the zone 2 location. Again, there is nothing installed between the seal and the boundary. If we look at the conduits on the other side of my two junction boxes, one of them is a type 4X junction box and the other is an increased safety E junction box. Neither of these are explosion proof, and due to that, there is no requirement for any seal on these conduits. The cables which enter into the explosion proof panel board are identified under 18154, and we can see subrule 4 indicates specifically that where the cable enters in, if it's explosion proof, needs to be EX or explosion rated. The connectors on my type 4X junction box are not listed within 18154. There is nothing within 18154 that indicates I would need to have an explosion seal or an FFM seal. And due to that, we are sort of open to simply placing a standard tech cable connector with no sealable fitting. What about the EXE junction box down below and also my standard three-phase motor? Well, these also are not identified specifically within 18154, and due to their absence of direction means that a seal is not required on any of these items. Hopefully this helps to clarify a bit where the sealing requirements are in zone 1 and 2 gas atmospheres.